please. Thank you. All right, I'd like to call this work session to order on AOs 2021-12, 13, 14, and 15, amending municipal code and terminating relevant emergency orders. We are scheduled today from 11 a.m. to 12:30 p.m., so a little longer than our normal work session. Let's start with the roll call, please.
Miss Allard?
Here.
Mr. Constant?
Here.
Mr. Dunbar? Miss Kennedy?
Here.
Miss LaFrance?
Here.
Mr. Perez-Verdia? Mr. Peterson?
Present.
Mr. Rivera?
Present.
Mr. Weddleton?
Here.
Ms. Zolotel?
Here.
Thank you.
I'm here also, Mr. Chair. I just got in a little late.
Thank you, Mr. Dunbar. As usual, if members would like to get in the queue, please put yourself in the chat or text me if you can't access the chat. So for today's work session, we're going to do this in two parts. First, we are going to go through the concept of the ordinances and just talk a little bit about the ideas behind them. And then we will go through each of the AOs. Timing is roughly about 30 minutes for the first part, talking about concept and idea, and then roughly 20 minutes for each of the ordinances, but we are, of course, flexible as needed. Okay, I'll go ahead and turn it over to the sponsors to get us started.
Good morning, everybody. This is Meg Zolotel, and we're going to do a team approach today with Suzanne LaFrance and John Weddleton as the sponsors. We've prepared a PowerPoint that somewhat combines the approach the chair mentioned. So if we move on to the next slide, it'll talk about how we're going to approach the conversation here, and we'll do our best to do it in this order. So first, we want to talk about an overview of how each emergency order was translated into an Anchorage ordinance format. That is that term EO, emergency order, to AO, and then have the larger conversation, or we can flip it, about whether any EO should move into ordinances to provide stability and predictability to industries, businesses, and residents. That second conversation, or the second point I mentioned, is really a conversation around a transition through the emergency toward normal. So if we start with the overview of how each emergency order was translated into an ordinance, first we want to state that we completely and unequivocally recognize that the current emergency, the current emergency orders are the law, have the effect of law, whether we call them emergency orders or mandates, and that we currently have some ordinances in code that are time limited or sunset, some related to COVID and some not related to COVID. And I would invite John and Suzanne, or Mr. Weddleton and Ms. LaFrance at this point to help provide further context for our conversation.
Yeah, I'd be happy to do that in kind of one aspect. And I think it is important that many people have missed is that, currently the mandates are law. Absolutely, they're enforced. And when these proposed ordinances simply bring the wording of the emergency ordinance into ordinance form, which is also a law. So in that respect, there really is no change. But what we have is essentially is a choice here: is do we stick with emergency ordinances that are kind of handed down by one person, which is very unusual in our system of government, or do we have
Just quickly, not emergency ordinances, emergency orders. There's a
emergency orders. Thank you. Yeah, appreciate that. Or have emergency orders, handed down by one person, which is unusual in our system of creating laws in this country, or do it through the normal legislative process, emergency orders, where people have input. And we see that. I mean, I think we've all been getting lots of emails with input on this, much in opposition, saying, no, don't do it at all. But others kind of highlighting challenges with masks. And this is the public process that should happen when we make laws. So we've brought these ordinances as a starting position, simply replicating the emergency orders. But as people who watch us see, our starting point on ordinances is rarely where we end up. There are amendments, sometimes an entire substitute version, and those amendments and changes reflect what we hear from the public. So we've, in this process, opened it up to the normal system where the public have input, and I would fully expect as we move forward that the starting point, which is in front of us now, will be very different from where we end up. And in particular there's been thoughts we did not bring in a end date for the mask ordinance, which has drawn the most attention. And so the extrapolation from people is that, so the proposal to always have masks and it will never end, which is, of course, kind of absurd. It wouldn't be that way. So an amendment somewhere would be, when will it end? Do we sunset it on a regular basis, sunset it based on certain criteria and so on? So those are the kinds of things that I, fully expect will be brought forward. So, and then another comment I think we've all heard is a lot of it's just rearranging the furniture. It's like, okay, it's the same thing. Why are you bothering to move this? And from my sense it's because it's a proper way to do things. And we need to move from this emergency order system to the normal legislative process. So that's mine. Suzanne, feel free to embellish.
Thank you, John. Thanks, Meg. And just following up with what Mr. Weddleton said about bringing this discussion through the legislative process and getting public input, and what Ms. Zelatel mentioned about creating an environment that provides stability for business, and maybe I think this comes up also later in the presentation, but also to transition to getting back to normal or business as usual, and getting out of a state of emergency, a public health emergency as defined in 3.8030, and to maybe get into a state of heightened alert. So some of the questions driving this approach too, or how do we deal with a scenario when we come to the end of the emergency declaration? And, we are hopeful that cases will continue to decline, that the vaccine continues to get out. But then, we recognize we're not in the clear yet. And there would be advantages to keeping some of the rules and flexibility that we have while in this state of emergency. And right now, we don't have any option but to either, continue the emergency declaration or end it. We wouldn't, have that flexibility with the different rules. And so another question is, does the path to reopening assume that we have to keep the emergency declaration in place until we're down to 1 case per 100,000? How can we use the health metrics to create stability? And part of it too is that public health emergency definition in section 2 or number 2, where it states one of the criteria poses a high probability of any of the following harms, provided that one or more persons located within the municipality or among the affected population. A large number of deaths in the affected population. B, a large number of serious or long-term disabilities. So at a certain point, if we're not within that, where do we go from there? And can we create some middle ground for a stable transition that also involves the public input? And I'll stop there. Thanks. Back to you, Meg.
Great. Thank you both. If we can move on to the next slide, please. So what we've done here for the ordinances is we've taken each one.
Ms. Zalatel, before you go on, just want to state for the record, we've been joined by Mr. Presbytia. Thanks.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Chair. We've taken each ordinance in numerical order And we've summarized them on the slides. And this is just a reminder that the slides are up on the work session page along with the text of the ordinances. So starting with this first one, this is AO 2021-12, and this is the ordinance that would allow for the curbside pickup of alcoholic beverages, marijuana products in response to COVID-19. So this one mirrors or has language consistent with current emergency order 8, which has been in place since April 26, 2020. And the impetus for the emergency order is that the state of Alaska suspended certain regulations and statutes permitting licensees to sell marijuana or marijuana products and to temporarily change their operating plan to allow for internet and phone orders, as well as exterior window and curbside pickup, and then did a similar thing with regard to alcohol. So this leaves the rules suspensions in place. The ordinance would, as long as the state of Alaska authorizes their suspension, and it would terminate the corresponding emergency order 8. If we go to the next slide, what we've done here is we've just pulled the relevant text from the ordinance. This one is with regard to alcohol pickup and delivery, because there are 2 different code sections, one for marijuana and one for alcohol. And you will see that it pretty much mirrors what is in the emergency order, and it is time limited in subsection A there during the time in which the state of Alaska allows. If we go on to the next page, this is the same. This is what was required of a change in 1080-310, again, during the time in which the state of Alaska allows. And I believe we also have on the line with us today, and I apologize for not mentioning this sooner, is Dennis Wheeler, our contract attorney, who's helping us with COVID-related projects, and he helped with these ordinances. So there are legal questions. We can certainly work to address those. So the intent here is to continue to go through the remaining ordinances. If there are questions on particular ones or things we would like to address, I don't care if we do that throughout or at the end. But I just want to open that up so that you can feel free to interrupt us or put your question in the queue so that we can address them in a timely manner. So that's the first AO. Moving on to the next one, please. This is 2021-13. This is the one I'm sure we've heard the most about. This is to require masks or cloth face coverings in response to COVID-19 and terminating the irrelevant emergency order. So this took the language out of Emergency Order 13 version 3, which was current as of which went into place November 6, 2020. And it adds the language of that emergency order into code at chapter 16, 140. And then it puts a new code section in there. So that's the medical and mental health practices section of the code. We've provided the language that states the purpose of the code in chapter 16.140, excuse me. And it is to exercise the municipality's police power for the public safety, health, and welfare in relation to the provision of medical or mental health practices. As Mr. Weddleton indicated, there's currently no sunset or review date in the AO draft. That would need to be determined. And then we've raised some questions about that. Is it tied to metrics? How would it be determined? Who should make that determination? And the enforcement language in this particular ordinance is the same as the corresponding emergency order currently in place. Ms. LaFrance or Mr. Weddleton, did you want to add anything about the framing or adding the masks or cloth face coverings to this project before we just do a quick review of some of the provisions?
I would just
no,
add.
I mean, that's fine. Yeah.
Agree. It's fine. Just that the discussion about metrics and sunset is one that it'd be very helpful to get feedback on.
Okay, so we'll go ahead and move through the ordinance. If we can go to the next slide, please. So this just starts with the mask or face covering applicability, which is from the first part of the emergency order translated into code. So it's very much the same scope, indoors in public settings or communal spaces outside the home, outdoors when 6 feet of physical distancing from non-household members or small chosen closed group cannot be maintained. And then it goes on to talk about, excuse me, the face shield. Again, this mirrors the current language in the emergency order. Next slide, please. The exceptions currently contained in the emergency order, there are 10. Those 10 are also contained in the ordinance. As we're all familiar with, children under the age of 2 are exempted. Similarly, other young children ages 2 to 5. And it goes on from there. Again, exactly out of the emergency order. Next slide, please. And then the enforcement, because this has come up a lot since the ordinance was introduced, is the same language as in the emergency order, and contains also in section 2, and all of these ordinances contain in a section 2 that the emergency order that corresponds here, EO 13 version 3, would be terminated and revoked in its entirety. So I think in walking through these 2 different ordinances, you get a good sense of how we proceeded in being very literal in our project of emergency order to ordinance. We'll go ahead and move on to the next ordinance, please. Excuse me. So this is 2021-14. I think a lot of you are well aware of this, where it allowed the expansion of on-site consumption of alcoholic beverages. This is language that we would add into the ordinance consistent with Emergency Order 12, which has been in place since June 17th, 2020. Again, this is tied to the state of Alaska, and the licensed premises are modified temporarily after being approved by the director of the Alcohol and Marijuana Control Office. This ordinance would leave the rules suspension in place as long as authorized by the state of Alaska. And I do have an update on the statistics here. Emergency Order 12 went into effect there. At the time the ordinance was filed, it was 50 businesses, but as of today, Mr. Schutte updated me that approximately 75 businesses have taken advantage of temporary outdoor use permits. Excuse me. Excuse me again. And this would terminate the corresponding Emergency Order 12. Mr. Chair, I saw a hand pop up. I'm not sure.
Yeah, it was Mr. Schutte, but he put his hand down. Did you want to add anything, Mr. Schutte?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Chris Schutte, Director of Economic and Community Development. I'm sorry to interrupt the wonderful presentation. I wanted to add a footnote to this that for the body and for the public to be aware. This is a combination of businesses that took advantage of the temporary expansion to outdoor spaces, both on their own property, plus bear in mind that the Anchorage Downtown Partnership did a successful program of closing a couple of city streets in order for this to occur for adjacent businesses. So there are both sort of, I guess, macro and micro implementations of this. I just wanted the group to be aware. Thank you.
Thanks. Before you continue, so just wanted to ask for folks who aren't speaking to please make sure that you are muted so that we're not hearing any background noise. That can sometimes be distracting, but also it gets into the record and it convolutes the record. So please, if you are not speaking, make sure that you're muted. Mr. Weddleton, you had something you wanted to add?
Thanks. I guess to add in a question is maybe Mr. Schutte or Wheeler is, so should the state's emergency proclamation end, then would this provision also end? Or Ms. Vogel?
Through the chair, Kate Vogel, municipal attorney. That would really depend on what the state chooses to do. So this is tied not to the state having an emergency order, but rather to the rules of the AMCO in this case, and so that's what this ties it to. And the state might undergo similar efforts to have certain rules be different if they decide to terminate their emergency order separately. We have heard their emergency orders often certainly will end, but there is some thoughts about creative ways that contracts can continue and things like that. So this isn't tied to the emergency declaration specifically.
Good, thank you.
Great, thank you. So we're just going to walk through the language here really quick. Next slide, please. So the language here is a lot longer than in some of the other ordinances, but it does track. And in terms of placing anything in Title 21, I did reach out to the planning director to make sure it was being placed in the right portion of Title 21. So this is what allows, this is the code provision that would allow for expanded facilities for alcohol consumption. The rationale for putting this into ordinance, of course, would be to provide some continuity and predictability for breweries and restaurants, excuse me, as we move, into the spring and summer, in the event that the Alaska rule remains suspended, that would allow for this, so they could plan accordingly. Next slide, please. All right, and this is the last one of the ordinances. This would suspend enforcement and allow retail sellers to provide plastic shopping bags. This adds language to carry out the intent of Emergency Order 4 version 3 in place since June 2nd, 2020. It's accomplished by suspending the enforcement provision of Chapter 15.95. We have created a sunset date of August 31st, 2021. This would allow retailers to utilize existing stock. Part of the rationale is to continue to support businesses that have chosen to limit their interactions between employees and customers by not permitting the use of personal bags or containers in their establishments. And it also facilitates curbside and delivery options. And reaching out to Mr. Schutte, I did ask for the initial rationale for the plastic bag emergency order, and it's similar to what is stated there, to limit the interactions by not permitting some retailers may not permit the use of personal bags or containers, and it also would relieve the bag fee requirement and lift the prohibition on using or distributing plastic bags. So this does the same thing with a really small code change. Next slide, please. And that is just suspension of the enforcement until a date certain, which we've put as August 31st, 2021. And that is the review of the ordinance changes. I think you're all probably familiar with the proposed ordinances as put forward. I'm going to turn this over to Ms. LaFrance and Mr. Weddleton for any additional comments, and then we'd be happy to open it up to questions.
Thanks, Meg, for going through that. Appreciate the presentation. I don't have anything to add to the specific ordinances as you've laid them out, so thanks.
Likewise, I look forward to the public hearing and comments from people on, what would be, ways to create a mask mandate that is functional to kind of limit the spread of a virus, but not burdensome, and it has clear parameters. I mean, clearly it's a big concern. A lot of people have trouble wearing masks, and for many it's just very symbolic of something that they oppose. And hopefully we'll get some constructive thoughts on practical uses of masks and so on. Thanks.
Thank you.
And then, sorry, Mr. Chair, really quick, I just wanted to add for my part, if I may, that my jumping into this project with Mr. Weddleton and Ms. LaFrance was really to allow us to consider a transitional period where we wouldn't necessarily have all of the emergency order provisions necessarily flipped off like a switch. So if you remember the graphic on the first page of this presentation, the red emergency light switch. And every time we come to the question of renewing the emergency declaration, that is one of my concerns, that we could simply turn off some things that are really beneficial to our community by not extending the emergency declaration and then only having a 3-day transition period. Well, 3 days, it's currently set up if we take up the current one on April 13th, and it would expire on the 16th. So this would allow for us to work through a transitional period and provide some predictability. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. All right, so at this point, if members have any questions, please put yourself in the queue. Just a quick reminder, this is a work session, so deliberation and debate on this ordinance should be set aside for the floor on Tuesday after the public hearing. But at this point, this is a perfect opportunity to ask any questions of either the administration or the sponsors of these ordinances. Okay, we'll go ahead and start with Ms. Allard.
Thank you, Chair. I appreciate it. My concern is that we really aren't doctors, and it's not our duty to be doctors. We need to step back and understand the duties that we have for the community and allow them to make choices that best work for them. One of my questions would lead to, with Mr. Weddleton, in regards to the mask, AO versus EO, and you said it is law, but there is. But the distinction is that with an EO, an emergency order, it's civilian law. And in order for any of us to put that into effect as a city or the muni, you have to take them to civilian court, anybody who's in violation of that. And I checked with legal, not our legal, but I've checked with other legal. And as an assembly order ordinance, it's quite different. And that means that law enforcement could come in. The other concerning thing is, if you guys can bring up or discuss the sponsors of these, is the sunset and the metrics. That also concerns me. And then the other comment that Ms. Zolotel made, and I don't know who wants to answer these questions, is when you stated flip the switch. And then Mr. Weddleton commented about the legislative process. Those both concern me because as a legislative process, we do give that authority, and we have voted on that as a body to give the mayor, the acting mayor, the ability to have the emergency orders. We've allowed that as a body, and that is part of the legislative process. And as far as flipping the switch, if we have an AO, that could take weeks or months. And that's kind of the slap in the face to our community. And it takes away from what our acting mayor should and should not be able to do. So maybe sometimes I disagree with things, and we all do at times, but I still wouldn't want to step on the mayor or the acting mayor's role of what we as a body, majority, have agreed to allow. So if you can talk a little bit more, Mr. Weddleton, about how you know or have you heard and why you think the AO is so different than the EO as laws, where one you can be arrested for and the others you can't. And maybe why Ms. Zolotel is against the flip the switch, so that we can go right back to what the community has wanted us to do. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. So I'm going to start with Ms. Vogel, then I will turn it over to the sponsors.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Through the chair, Assemblymember Allard, the existing EO is able to be enforced under AMC 380.090. It gives the option to enforce the regulation through law enforcement or through civil penalties. And similarly, an ordinance could specify how it would be enforced. The distinction between civilian and military law isn't applicable here. The difference between civil law and criminal law also doesn't hinge on whether it's an emergency order or part of the code. Code already speaks to what enforcement is able to take place with emergency orders, and code could specify what enforcement is available for any new amendments to the code. I hope that helps.
Thank you. Turn it over to the sponsors now.
Am I unmuted? Yes. Hi, just Weddleton. Yeah. Okay. But that, I guess, addresses that. The changing an ordinance, if it really depends on how the ordinance is written with an end date. I mean, there could be simply, this sunsets every 4 weeks, and to extend it, we would at a meeting have to address it, have public hearing, and extend it. Or sunset could be if certain factors are in play. If I think we focus here just on COVID, but if we hit, that a trigger has been 10 cases per 100,000, which is high risk, and if we were somewhere lower than that, then this would end in. It depends, it depends on how it's worded, but those kinds of things are potentials. But if there were suddenly an instance where there is no need for mass, we could meet and do an emergency ordinance right away within a day and suspend this. And we have quite a length of time to then address it in a regular meeting to do it in kind of the normal process. So ordinances can end very, very quickly. We can act with an emergency ordinance the next day. So it's not necessarily true that it would take weeks. So it really depends on how, an end date is approached, in the ordinance. And we expect probably more than one amendment to be discussed on how that's done. Thanks.
And then with regard to the idea of flipping a switch, I think we should look at some of the actions the body has already taken. We have put some COVID-related actions into ordinance, and there's actually another one before us on Tuesday night that is not these particular ordinances, but one around waiving fees. So particularly with regard to the marijuana and alcohol provisions, and even the plastic bags to a large extent, I don't see a substantial difference there where it just allows for some stability and continuity, where we might be in a heightened state for a period of time, like Ms. LaFrance suggested, but where there may not be an emergency declaration in place.
Chair, can I just follow up real quick? Just
Sure.
real quickly. Okay. Thank you, Ms. Vogel. If I said military, I meant to say law enforcement. I did speak to APD, and they said there is nothing that they could do right now to enforce any sort of jail time for anybody who doesn't wear a mask with the mandates. So I apologize if I mentioned military. I meant to say law enforcement. As far as being able to put this as an AO, I mean, we need to listen to our community. And even though you said we can come in and we can have a meeting, the truth of the matter is, well, that could just happen with the EO, with the acting mayor having the orders right now. And as soon as the emergency proclamation ends, and as soon as the emergency orders that we've provided her end, there is no further discussion. So I appreciate both of their feedbacks. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Ms. Kennedy?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. My question is in regard to some of the things that I don't see in an ordinance. When we were starting to talk about ending the declaration of emergency back, probably October timeframe, in those discussions, one of the things that the administration always brought forward was, well, we have to be under a declaration of emergency or else we don't have the ability to move into contracting very quickly. We don't have the ability to reposition employees as they're needed in a variety of different new positions. And so I know when I talked about the idea of setting up something where the assembly can actually make those kinds of calls and exemptions that would allow contracts to be handled a little bit differently and actually the contracting process to be handled differently. I was under the impression that we were going to talk more about how to put the kinds of functions that the municipality normally deals with into the hands of the assembly, so that we wouldn't have to be under a declaration of emergency, but the assembly would be able to make those calls or provide some kind of authority for those kinds of exemptions to those processes that were being said we need. We can't just shut down. We have to maintain these certain people in these positions. So we're basically exempting things that would be normal processes within the municipality. So can somebody speak to why those two particular functions that happen under an emergency declaration were not addressed in any of these ordinances, or if there was even any conversation about those particular kinds of functions? Thanks.
Mr. Chair, may I?
Go ahead.
Excuse me. Thank you, Ms. Kennedy. I appreciate the question. Really, it's been a matter of time. We wanted to get started. These seem to be the most direct ways to do that literal translation of an emergency order into an ordinance. The idea of appropriation and approving contracts quickly is certainly on my radar, but I haven't had a chance to fully dig into it yet. We still have a month and a bit. So that's why that's not there. But we did pass a resolution at our last meeting in the consent agenda that asked the administration to work with the collective bargaining units to see if they can put telework, work from home, and other work arrangements into administrative letters or administrative agreements before the end of March to address one of the reasons we have heard that we need an emergency declaration in place around how employees are either assigned or their current work arrangements.
Well, thank you. No, I appreciate that answer because, like I said, those are the things that I would rather see us working on, and maybe that's my cue to start that as well. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Mr. Constant?
I thought Mr. Presverdia was in the queue.
He took himself out.
Okay. So two questions at this time. I hear about stability and continuity, and then I think I heard the suggestion that one of the intents is to see that these things continue even if an emergency order doesn't. Is that, in fact, a principle behind any of these? And then the second question is along the lines of, we've heard that, and I take on full good faith that the reasoning behind this is to kind of take the posture from emergency to more standing business, but that the current situation we have is the administration can very flexibly, immediately make changes to these orders by putting in 10 people as kind of trying to come to a single point, a legislative body, to do the work of an executive. What's the conversation the sponsors have had on this theory of supplanting kind of the orderly implementation of the emergency by an individual and their team versus us 10 ducks running in circles doing our own thing?
Well, I could address that a bit.
Yeah, go
so ahead,
Chris,
thanks. So, I think, it is harder having 10 people have to kind of come together, and we do it through a public process. There's public hearings, so it is slower doing it. And, I think you know, a year ago or 6, 7, 8 months ago, the speed that the administration could do it was absolutely critical. But we've reached a point where we're kind of familiar with what's going on. And so we can step back to this more complicated, difficult way of dealing with things because we have much greater understanding of where we are with this virus and what different actions seem to result in.
So there was a second question there, and they're tied together really. And is the intent of this to, because I heard it stated, ensure that some of these things could continue if an emergency ended?
Mr. Chair?
You know, that, sorry, Meg, Meg, you get to do that, I guess.
Oh, no, go ahead, John. Susie.
You know, that is the effect, Chris, where you can end the EP and still have these in effect. There's also the possibility
Sorry, Mr.
that
Weldon, did you mean the emergency order?
Emergency order, thanks.
Thanks.
Well, the emergency, yeah, I guess emergency order, or I mean, if the emergency proclamation ended, then the EO goes away. So whichever, then these would stay in effect. But what that potentially could do too is then we have an easier way of saying we don't need that emergency proclamation anymore and get away from the system, which is just not the way we should be doing business if we can help it. So it eases that transition to get away from the EP. And I think Crystal made some points that there were a couple other big pieces that we've also been kind of clinging to maintain there really are good reasons for continuing the emergency proclamation, even aside from the various EOs underneath it. But I think you're right, Chris. This creates a route to continue these things after the emergency proclamation could be ended.
So I would just conclude then that from where I sit, it doesn't make good sense to create a burdensome bureaucratic process, which includes multiple hearings and time, to scale up or down our response as needed when currently it's the whip of a very sharp pen that can conclude all of these things or extend them or minimize them, as opposed to creating a hardened bureaucratic encoded method. And so for my part, it's a high bar to support any of this because I don't see the value or the appropriateness of us substituting our collective judgment for that of an executive who has the right to do this. I don't want to see a mask order last 1 second longer than it needs. And I don't think that an emergency ordinance to repeal these things in the short term while we get to repealing them and have the process to get there makes sense in the context of stability and continuity. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. LaFrance, did you want to add anything?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I was just going to comment on, getting us into a period of heightened alert versus an emergency, and that I have heard some people say, well, isn't that just semantics? Maybe partly so, but I would also say this is the first time we have been in a pandemic and in a health emergency. And going back to that notion of on or off, if there is a way to create a transitional period where we recognize that okay, the numbers are way down, but the advisory is, to continue with masking, and those are tied to metrics, that could be, it could be a more stable way to ease out of this scenario. I think it's a conversation, that it's worth having wherever it ends up going, because it's one that has come up over and over with constituents. Why don't you guys figure out a way to get us out of this state of emergency, but in a way where we're still effectively responding. So I also appreciate what Ms. Kennedy brought up, and we had talked a little bit about the procurement issue, and that's definitely something that still needs to be addressed. Thanks.
Thank you. Ms. Zolotel?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just wanted to raise that we're seeing that possibility of an emergency declaration or proclamation end, not necessarily because an emergency is over at the state level. And that I also think that if we need to or want to consider talking about a transition phase, I don't want to see that rushed. And so that is why these are put forward multiple months before the current expiration of the emergency declaration to test out, this process and if it can work, and to have these conversations in a really thoughtful way about does our legislative, excuse me, how responsive is our legislative process, and can it effectively do some of this work. I think we've seen some successes with that in other ordinances. I do acknowledge that I think the mask and the mask and face covering ordinance is challenging, but it is also why we put it forward so that we could see what the process might look like. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Peterson?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My question is for someone from the legal department, probably Ms. Vogel. It has to deal with what happens if the state's emergency order is discontinued, and how do we position ourselves more advantageous with these ordinances? If we keep the emergency order the way it is now, are we better off if the state cancels their emergency order, or are we better off if we switch these mandates over to ordinances?
Through the chair, this is Kate Vogel, Municipal Attorney. As you know, our ability to declare an emergency or to maintain an emergency or to end an emergency does not rise and fall with the state's declaration of emergency. However, if the state ends their declaration of emergency, there may be things that we want to step in and do that were for functions that we're currently relying on the state and the state's state of emergency to do. One that springs to mind is our EO currently incorporates by reference the state's travel order, and we rely on certainly a lot of other functions of the state's emergency powers to help our operations, including vaccine distribution and a lot of other functions. Not all of it are things that we can fix on our own. If the state's emergency power ends, it will negatively impact our ability to respond to the emergency. So examples of things that I think it would be quite difficult for us to do that the state's emergency power does right now include changing licensing requirements with respect to telehealth, and licensing of our medical professionals is done at the state level. Similarly, agreements with Medicaid between CMS and the state, that's a contracting issue that again happens at the state level. And there are numerous other sort of tie-ins that will be disrupted if the state's emergency authorization is ended. Certainly, that would be one more factor where the nimbleness of having an emergency declaration allows the municipality to put in without a large process needed emergency orders on a very short-term basis. So that would be a scenario just like the arrival of a variant or new needs with respect to vaccine distribution, where having the emergency in the on position helps the mayor be able to respond. I hope that helped.
Okay, thank you. Appreciate it.
Thank you. Ms. Kennedy.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. My question is in regard to what we already have in code in terms of the Assembly's ability to issue emergency ordinances. Well, actually, that's in charter. So could somebody kind of compare and contrast to me what these ordinances would do versus what we actually already have the authority to do, and that is to issue an emergency ordinance at any meeting, provided we have the required threshold of votes. And I want to say it's 3/4 number. Yeah, it's 3/4. So anyway, like I said, how does this really compare with the ability that we really already have in Charter Article 10, the ability to do emergency ordinances? Thanks.
Ms. Vogel?
Thank you. Through the chair, I think of emergency ordinances and emergency orders as very different things. Emergency ordinances allow the assembly to act more quickly, and one of the biggest things that they do is eliminate that public hearing requirement that normally applies to ordinances passed by the assembly. So they're in place and allowed to be used when the conditions are needed for an ordinance to pass quickly without having that kind of time. There's a higher vote threshold and there's a 60-day sunset provision on emergency ordinances. That doesn't have to rise or fall with the existence of a disaster or public health emergency or any other type of emergency that's in the sort of global meaning of the term emergency, but it is a way for the assembly to act more quickly. Doing this as proposed here, this EO to AO process isn't putting these AOs in as emergency ordinances. This is having them or proposing to have them passed as assembly ordinances, regular AOs. That means they wouldn't be subject to the higher vote threshold, they wouldn't be subject to the 60-day sunset provision, and they would obviously have the full public process, which we're already participating in. So I don't really view those as one and the same thing. And then the other thing I would point out about the charter is it talks about emergencies, declaring an emergency, and who ends an emergency. And I really think that that's talking about this state of emergency, which we're in now, that overall on and off switch, as opposed to this issue of when is the assembly able to act more quickly.
Can I follow up on that, Mr. Chair, please?
Sure, go ahead.
Thank you. Well, Ms. Vogel, I guess my question still remains the fact that this is a tool that the assembly already has in terms of having 3/4 vote to make sure that all that is done correctly. And certainly stating that there is a period of time, a limitation there, 60 days, which of course, even at the end of 60 days, by that time, the assembly could put forward something else that has a little more longevity to it. Within that 60 days, they could pass another ordinance to cover any other period of time that maybe needed it to be extended by. But essentially, isn't that basically the tool that we have at our disposal right now to be able to handle anything that we consider we're doing because of a unique situation, an emergency situation, and out of the ordinary situation? Thank you.
Through the chair, I'm not sure that I understand the question, unfortunately. So I'll try one more time, and if you can help me figure out where I'm not understanding, that'd be great. So emergency ordinances is an ability for the assembly to act without having the normal process. There needs to be something that justifies that as far as the assembly is concerned, but it doesn't require what the code requires for there to be a state of emergency, and what the charter requires for there to be a state of emergency. So it is an assembly power to forego having public process in terms of waiting periods to pass an ordinance, public notice provisions, all of that. And there needs to be a justification, but that's not in my mind, the tool that the charter primarily provides for responding to an emergency. By which I mean a state of emergency. The charter there says the mayor may declare an emergency, the assembly can end an emergency, and that triggers the use of police powers by the mayor. So to me, the charter was contemplating two very different scenarios: emergency ordinances being able to be used whether or not there's an emergency declaration in place, and presumably generally being used when there is no emergency declaration in place. And then likewise, what's happening here is an attempt to introduce some measures on a longer term scale, but not using the emergency ordinance process at all, because they're not trying to avoid public process. They're in fact inviting that in and asking for public hearing and testimony, and therefore it doesn't trigger any of the privileges or constraints of the emergency ordinance process. In other words, it doesn't trigger the higher vote total, and it also doesn't evade public hearing. So that's why I think the charter talks about these two things. I think they're meant to be used in different contexts, and no one in introducing this process in this particular way is invoking the characteristics of an emergency ordinance.
Okay, thank you, Ms. Vogel. I guess I would disagree. I believe that the tool is there so that the assembly actually essentially has the same power that the mayor does in terms of dealing with emergencies without public input, because that's essentially what happens with an emergency order as well. But anyway, we can, I guess, just move on, Mr. Chair, in regard to that, because it really won't impact these particular ordinances. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Allard?
Thank you, Chair. Ms. Vogel, just to go back a couple of questions ago, just so I understand this, are you saying that if the state, the governor, the state of Alaska, says we no longer have an emergency declaration in place, and that he feels our state is able to carry on, that the Muni wants to have the ability to override that and continue, as I would say, until we're open 100%, a lockdown for almost 300,000 people? Did I get that correct from you?
Through the chair, this is Kate Vogel, municipal attorney. My comment is that the municipality's power and ability to declare an emergency does not rise and fall with a state declaration of emergency. These are independent decisions made by independent bodies. Similarly, the fact that we're still under a national emergency does not impact whether or not the municipality of Anchorage is in a state of emergency. I note that Mr. Bockenstedt maybe wanted to chime in on this question.
Thank you. Mr. Bockenstedt?
Yes, thank you. I also want to just clarify for everyone that the governor has requested the ability to extend the disaster declaration to, I believe, September 30th with the legislation that he has introduced. The issue is that he cannot now unilaterally extend the disaster declaration beyond February 14th because the legislature is in session. So I just wanted to make it very clear. The governor still would like to see the disaster declaration extended to September 30th, with the caveat that the commissioner of DHHS can make the recommendation that it is no longer needed before September 30th. But what we are dealing with is the legislature somewhat being unable to come together, especially on the House side, and potentially be able to pass something.
Chair, can I just do a quick follow-up?
Sure.
Thank you. Ms. Vogel, is that a yes or a no on my question?
Do you want to restate your question?
Sure. So if the state says that we have no emergency order and there is not one in place as emergency proclamation, does the Muni want to override that and continue with an emergency mandates?
Through the chair, my answer is, I think, the legal one, which is these don't rise and fall with each other. So I guess I'm not able to speak to wants to or doesn't want to. I'm able to speak to the legal meaning of the legislature not being able to organize and not ratify or continue a state of emergency doesn't impact the existence of the emergency here in Anchorage.
All right, so my question won't be answered. Thank you, Chair.
Well,
Thank you.
Mr. Chair, if I could, I would just say that as the governor and the state have repeatedly said as well, we have our own ability through our charter and through state statute and the Constitution to have our own public health emergency powers. So regardless of what the state ends up deciding to do, we get to make the ultimate decision about what is in the best interest of Anchorage. And we will continue to do that regardless of what the governor or the state legislature do, as that is our responsibility as the leaders of this community.
Thank you. I'm going to go ahead and move us on. Mr. Constant?
Yeah, thanks. I think the key word in that whole thing was override. And there is no overriding the state. We don't do that, and they don't override us with our health powers. We have independent authority to make those decisions. I think that's the answer. The answer is no, we don't have the power to override what the state's doing, whatever they do. But that's not my question. My question is back to this idea of converting EOs to AOs. There's a couple areas that we've discussed that aren't included, but there are a couple more areas, I think, and I would like to understand for an emergency ordinance, Ms. Vogel, does that allow us also to suspend Title 21 review where it's required in the code in terms of visits to planning and zoning or in the context of labor negotiations?
Through the chair, Assemblymember Constant, I'm not sure that it does. It's an interesting question, and many of those things would be much harder to do without an emergency. So the code and the charter talk about emergencies and emergencies superseding other laws. There's not this contemplation of emergency ordinances coming in and serving that function, because the charter talks about in a state of emergency that power being given to the mayor. So I guess I would need to see the specific thing that was being attempted in an emergency ordinance, but again, that provision of charter isn't really talking about overriding other laws or suspending the normal rules, except the rules that govern passing ordinances. That's right. What an emergency ordinance is all about. It's about a way for the assembly to act more quickly when there is an absolute need, by having a higher vote threshold and getting to avoid this public hearing. I think there are complicating factors that I would just want more time to analyze for any particular piece of legislation and whether it was appropriate. Certainly, there'd be a problem with any ordinance in that manner that was trying to supersede charter provisions, obviously, where it's easier for ordinances to supersede other provisions that are in code.
Right, but not probably negotiated agreements or issues that have pretty belabored process that are beyond our rights, but in fact are rights of other bodies. So I think I agree with you that it's complex, and I would take a step further, because I'm not an attorney, and say I think that our powers would be very limited down that road, and we won't find ourselves in a position to do as flexibly what some might suggest we could using an emergency process that is in the legislative branch.
Thank you. Ms. LaFrance?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I had put myself in the queue to comment on the emergency orders piece, which has come back up again. As sponsors, we did take a look at the options available to the Assembly. And one of the issues, of course, with the emergency ordinance approach is that it, as has been noted, eliminates the public hearing and eliminates the public process. So again, this is a big part of the intent of this approach is to put it through the public process and get that input and have those hearings. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Ms. Zolotel?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I have a question with regard to, and this might be for Ms. Vogel or Mr. Wheeler. We have passed some ordinances specifically related to COVID-19 response, and there's another one submitted by the administration for Tuesday night around waiving fees. Is there a substantial difference between that type of action that we've taken in the past or contemplating taking on Tuesday, and in particular, the two ordinances that are proposed here around alcohol and marijuana that are currently covered by emergency orders?
Which of the attorneys would like to respond? Mr. Wheeler, I see your hand up.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. In my opinion, I don't think so, because one of the things that I've been looking at for this project is that the premise of the emergency orders and the premise of an emergency ordinance under Charter 1003 is premised entirely on what constitutes an emergency. And by definition, the Charter, an emergency is this unforeseen circumstance. I think it's fair to say that, given we're almost into this a year now, the nature of COVID and its impact is no longer unforeseen. There may be some variations as we go forward in terms of how we address certain aspects of our response to that. But to the extent that you're now looking to normalize the process of dealing with this and normalizing how you address the problems that it creates is not unlike anything else you might do in the public health arena. And provide relief or rules governing the behavior of the constituents that it affects. So, like clean air, clean water, traffic laws, anything else that addresses public health, I think these are a way to create a norm, even though it is a difficult and crisis-related situation. Thank you.
And Ms. Vogel?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I think that whether or not we're in a state of emergency is a question for the mayor and for the assembly, and that process is set out to determine whether there's an emergency. I certainly think COVID is handing us unforeseen circumstances all the time, and that is why you've seen emergency orders and our responses to COVID change rapidly throughout this pandemic. I certainly don't think we're in a steady state yet. But that wasn't Ms. Zolotel's first question, which was, are those particular two EOs to AOs substantially different than other changes that the Assembly has made this year? I think my short answer is I'm not sure that they're analogous in type, but they aren't super different either. We're talking about the Assembly acting to change its own code, where its own code in particular, as it, if it was enforced by all of its terms, is standing in the way of response to COVID-19. So in the instance of the public health fee that's on the agenda for Tuesday, there's normally a fee issued by our health department, and there was a desire because of impacts of COVID-19 to waive that with respect to certain entities. And so that is a response, and it's needing to change a fee that's otherwise provided in code. And then here, the EOs to AOs of the two that you specifically highlighted would similarly be working to not enforce certain provisions of code, which maybe work a hardship in this case. So where the state is allowing more flexibility with respect to to-go alcohol, eliminating portions of the code that are inconsistent with that. In that way, they seem like easy fits for ordinance and for assembly action. Where there are issues of sunset provisions or trying to tie things to state action that's maybe slightly different than the other ordinances that have come before the assembly where there is a specific, this is a one-time fee waiver or 1 year fee waiver. But those are probably small details.
Is there any other discussion?
Yep, I'm in the queue, Mr. Chair.
Mr. Constant.
Just a note back to what I heard Mr. Wheeler say, and I just want to kind of agree with what Ms. Vogel said, and that while it is the opinion of some, a year later, we are no longer in an emergency, that these things should be normalized, or the assembly is having conversations about normalizing, whatever that means exactly. I still don't quite understand. I certainly don't believe normal is having a mask mandate in the code. But to that end, I think that we have a consistent record over the course of at least the last 5 months of making the determination, despite the argument being made upon the dais that the emergency is over, or we should end this declaration, or that one, or that the body continues to state its opinion that there is still a condition of emergency, and that the record is very clear on that, despite what opinions might be here and there. And that might be a litigatable question at some point, but I think I want to make it really clear that never so far have 6 members voted to affirm the end of an emergency.
Thank you. All right, seeing no further discussion, these 4 ordinances will be before us for a public hearing and a possible vote on Tuesday. I understand the sponsors may seek approval from the body to push the continue the public hearing and debate on item AO 2021-13 regarding the mask or cloth face mandate. But otherwise, I look forward to the deliberation on Tuesday. So seeing no further discussion, I'm going to go ahead and close this work session. Thanks, everyone.